On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker while Berlin fell under Soviet fire. Within a matter of hours, the man who had provoked a world war was dead, and the Third Reich vanished with him. His body was doused with gasoline and burned by his aides in the Chancellery garden. The remains were found by the Red Army, which kept the discovery secret for decades. Fragments of skull, teeth, and ashes were hidden, relocated and analyzed under strict confidentiality. What remained of the dictator was treated as prohibited evidence. Why did he decide to commit suicide instead of surrendering? What really happened to his body after his death? What part of this story was destroyed and what still remains hidden? The last refuge, Berlin Underground. As the Soviet divisions advanced relentlessly from the east and the Allied bombings turned Berlin into a lunar landscape of rubble and fire, Adolf Hitler made a decision that would seal his fate: to settle permanently in the underground complex beneath the Reich Chancellery. That concrete shelter, originally conceived as temporary protection against air attacks, would become the final stage of one of the most destructive regimes in human history. The Fuhrer bunker was not a mere military construction. Its history dated back to 1936, when the first level, known as the Vorbunker, had been built as part of the architectural expansions of the Nazi governmental complex. Years later, in 1944, when the war already showed irreversible signs of defeat, the lower level was constructed. The Fuhrer bunker itself, situated approximately 8 meters underground. Its reinforced concrete ceilings were nearly 3 meters thick, designed to withstand the direct impact of large-caliber bombs. This depth offered more than physical protection. It represented the progressive isolation of a regime losing touch with the reality of its own destruction. During those final months, the bunker acquired a singular atmosphere of closure and decay. The sounds of the outside world, artillery explosions, nighttime bombings, the distant roar of collapsing buildings, filtered through the concrete as constant reminders that Berlin was dying above their heads. Inside the underground, time passed with a different gravity. The clocks marked not only the hours of the day, but the countdown towards the end of an empire that had promised to last 1,000 years. The spaces inhabited by Hitler and his closest circle constituted a strange mix of a military command post and an improvised residence. Secretaries, personal assistants, security officers, and members of the High Command shared narrow corridors and meeting rooms where decisions increasingly disconnected from any strategic reality were made. Luxury furniture, looted from the upper offices of the Chancellery before they were destroyed, created a grotesque contrast with the situation of absolute collapse. Paintings by German masters hung on bare concrete walls. Persian rugs covered cold cement floors. In the map room, a portrait of Frederick the Great, the Prussian king whom Hitler obsessively admired, watched over the nightly meetings where non-existent divisions were moved around on maps of a front that could no longer be sustained. Hitler still maintained certain routines that gave him the illusion of continuity: breakfast at fixed hours, meetings with officers, review of frontline reports. But the difference was enormous compared to the years of triumph. Now the front was not in Poland, France, or Russia, but in the streets of Berlin, a few kilometers from the bunker. The divisions that moved on the maps existed only on paper. The reinforcements that were promised would never arrive. The steel doors and windowless corridors increasingly isolated the top of power, creating a bubble where defeat could be denied for a few more hours. The conversations in the bunker hallways during the final days of April took on a tone of barely concealed resignation. The officers exchanged looks that conveyed what no one dared to express openly. Everything was over. The arrival of Eva Braun at the underground complex intensified the residential and personal character of those last days. Her presence partially transformed the bunker from a military post into a domestic refuge, a space where the dictator's intimacy mixed with the final orders of a lost war. The architectural design of the bunker caused inevitable psychological effects. The narrow corridors, barely lit by electric bulbs that flickered when nearby bombs fell, created a feeling of progressive confinement. The command rooms, although equipped with telephones and radios, functioned as echo chambers where orders were issued without certainty that they would reach their destination or have any effect. The 3-meter concrete ceiling symbolized both protection and imprisonment. During the final Soviet offensive, the air inside the bunker became increasingly stale. The ventilation systems operated at their limit. Moisture seeped through the wall joints. The distant explosions made the entire structure vibrate, dislodging cement dust that accumulated on the desks and uniforms. By mid-April, Hitler was effectively isolated from real command over the armed forces. The commanders who still reached the bunker informed him about depleted reserves, collapsed defenses, and the inevitability of surrender. Meetings became increasingly brief and devoid of strategic content. The regime's official press had ceased to have relevance in the face of the Soviet artillery surrounding the city. The bunker ceased to be the center of power to become the scene of its institutional dissolution, a place where orders were issued that no one would obey, where plans were drawn that would not be executed, where the fiction of command was maintained only within those concrete walls. Everyday life in the shelter during those final days painted a picture of forced normality against a backdrop of catastrophe. The secretaries transcribed orders without tactical sense. The duty officers received reports on military positions already abandoned. The men of the personal guard watched over the entrances to a bunker filled with people who knew they would not come out alive. This contrast between the routine and the exceptional defines the atmosphere of those last days. A dispatch phone operating under the constant roar of battle in the streets, a typewriter producing official documents while Berlin disintegrated over their heads. Several of the officers who remained in the bunker during those final days were later interrogated by Soviet forces. Their testimonies converge in describing an atmosphere of tacit farewell. Many of those present understood that the bunker would be their tomb. Some distributed cyanide capsules among the staff. Others burned personal documentation. A few attempted to organize escape routes through the sewer tunnels that connected the complex with other parts of the city, but the real chances of escape were minimal. As the Soviet tanks penetrated the central neighborhoods of Berlin, the escape tunnels and emergency exits of the bunker began to be used for evacuations of minor personnel. The complex itself became a target of nearby bombings that made the structure tremble. The sewers of Berlin, in those final days of April, served as desperate escape routes or as improvised mass graves. The bunker experienced simultaneous degradation in 2 dimensions: physical due to the military siege surrounding it, and symbolic due to the collapse of the system it represented. The last refuge of the Reich was not simply a physical place, but the architectural manifestation of its decay. A bunker that mixed luxury and misery, nominal command and actual surrender, the illusion of protection and the reality of siege. Under those concrete walls, the final act took shape. The suicide of the Fuhrer, followed by the handling of his body, and finally the birth of a myth about his disappearance. The bunker marked the beginning of the dusk, both material and symbolic, and foreshadowed the way history would confront the question of the remains or the absence of Adolf Hitler. What would happen in the following hours inside that underground refuge would close not only a biography, but an entire chapter of European history. The end of the Fuhrer, the suicide in the bunker. In the twilight of April 30th of 1945, the act was consummated that symbolically closed the trajectory of Adolf Hitler. It was not only an individual suicide, but the final gesture of a system that had no other option than death. To understand this episode with historical rigor, it is necessary to link several simultaneous processes: the dictator's internal decision, the practical preparation of his surroundings, the mechanics of his death, and the immediate reaction of those around him. By the end of April, the encirclement of Berlin was complete. The Soviet offensive, launched by the Red Army under the command of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, had reduced the capital of the Reich to an urban battlefield where every street, every building, every basement was fiercely contested. Inside the bunker, the roar of artillery and the rumble of tanks were perfectly audible. The maps that Hitler reviewed showed a no-win situation. The defensive divisions were dissolving, the reserves were depleted, and military hope was non-existent. Under this pressure, the ritual structures of power acquired an almost theatrical character. The audiences with generals, the official dispatches, the military planning meetings ceased to have a practical function to become farewell ceremonies. Hitler began to acknowledge the impossibility of any victory. The reports he received confirmed what was already evident. Berlin would fall in a matter of days, perhaps hours. In that context, he dictated his political and personal testament, where he appointed Karl Dönitz as his successor and reaffirmed his worldview, even in the last lines he would write. He also decided to marry Eva Braun in those final hours and gave precise instructions regarding his own death. The testimonies of the survivors of the bunker agree that Hitler clearly expressed that he would not allow himself to be captured alive by the Soviet forces. The idea of being publicly exhibited, judged, or executed by his enemies was intolerable to him. He sought to control even his end, determining the moment, the place, and the manner of his death. This set of decisions reveals that the suicide was not an impulsive act, but a planned conclusion amidst the absolute collapse. On the 29th and 30th of April, the bunker staff acted according to precise instructions. Sensitive documentation was destroyed, personal belongings were packaged, cyanide capsules were distributed to the closest entourage, security aides, nurses, and the personal physician received detailed orders regarding the preparations. A particularly revealing scene was the order to poison Hitler's dogs, including his German shepherd Blondie. This seemingly domestic gesture conveyed a clear mandate. Everything that represented the Fuhrer had to be destroyed before his own death. The wedding with Eva Braun took place in the final hours of April 29th or the early morning of the 30th, according to different testimonies. The ceremony was brief, held in the map room before a very small circle of witnesses. Although this detail is more symbolic than military, it shows the awareness of the end. Hitler not only acknowledged the defeat, but also shaped his departure according to a personal ritual. The wedding ceremony amid the siege reflected the intimate dimension of those final moments, where private decisions intertwined with the public collapse of the Reich. In the early afternoon hours of April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun retired to the Führer's private room in the bunker. The accounts of the survivors converge on the essential facts. Hitler ingested a cyanide capsule and simultaneously shot himself in the head with his Walter pistol. Eva Braun took only the poison capsule and died almost instantly, without resorting to shooting. The bodies were discovered shortly afterward by the valet Heinz Linger and the assistant Otto Günscher, who were the first to enter the bedroom after hearing the shot. The exact time varies slightly depending on the sources. Most point to around 3:30 in the afternoon, although some testimonies mention a range between 3:30 and 4. This temporal imprecision is understandable given the chaos of the moment and the lack of direct witnesses to the act itself. The relevant fact is that the suicide occurred in that interval, in the middle of an afternoon where the Soviet bombardment over Berlin was reaching its maximum intensity. After discovering the bodies, those who remained in the bunker acted according to the prior instructions that Hitler had left. The bodies were wrapped in blankets and transported by the aides to an area near the Chancellery garden on the surface for incineration. Inside the bunker, a temporary official silence was decreed. For several hours, false orders were continued to be transmitted by radio to maintain the appearance that the command was still operational. This interval of official silence was part of the established protocol. The news of the Führer's death was not to be disseminated immediately to avoid the total moral collapse of the last units still resisting. The attendants who collected the bodies acted with mechanical efficiency, following improvised protocols for an unprecedented situation in the history of the regime. There was no ceremony, there were no solemn words, only the urgency to follow the dictator's final instructions. Burn the bodies to prevent them from falling into Soviet hands. The voices of these aides, later captured in interrogations by the Allies, would provide the primary testimonies of what occurred in that room and in the immediate moments afterward. Although Hitler's suicide was widely accepted by historians based on these converging testimonies, it was not immediately verified by the Western powers. For months, even years, rumors circulated about his possible survival and escape. FBI files show that open investigations were maintained until 1947 on reports that Hitler had escaped to South America or to hideouts in Spain. These rumors, fueled in part by Soviet opacity about the forensic findings, would generate a mythology of survival that would persist for decades. The British intelligence service systematically collected the accounts of several secretaries, guards, and aides who had been present in the bunker. Their consolidated report concluded that Hitler had repeatedly expressed his intention to commit suicide rather than surrender. The interrogations of Heinz Linger and Otto Günscher, carried out by the Soviets after their capture, provided detailed descriptions of the condition of the bodies, the clothing they were wearing, dark jacket for him, light dress for her, and the positioning of the bodies when they were found. In 2025, declassified Soviet documents provided additional details on the statements of these key witnesses. The interrogation notes include descriptions of dental pieces and skull fragments that would later be used for forensic identification. These sources confirmed the combination of poison and shooting as the method of suicide, a redundancy that Hitler had planned to ensure his instant death. Hitler's suicide represented a dramatic closure without alternatives for the National Socialist regime. It was not a military defeat in the classic sense of formal capitulation, but a personal and collective closure. The supreme leader disappeared without surrender, without trial, without direct legal consequences. This left a symbolic wound in the memory of the 20th century. A criminal of unprecedented historical magnitude died by his own hand, but would not be subjected to public trial nor legal execution. The very decision to marry Eva Braun in that last bend of history acted as a ritual of decomposition, a personal gesture inserted in an extreme political moment. The conjunction of death and marriage thus appears as the literary epilogue of an era of terror where the intimate and the historical fused in a final act devoid of grandeur, reduced to the sordidness of a besieged bunker. The moment of the suicide cannot be separated from the physical space where it occurred. The map rooms, the guard corridors, the private room with its concrete walls formed the intimate setting of the act. The walls without windows, the scarcity of natural light, the constant noise of the bombardment. All of this determined the atmosphere in which the suicide was committed. The testimonies mention that Hitler had rejected proposals to leave Berlin to move south, toward the Alpine redoubt that some officers suggested as the last defensive position. He considered that the final act should occur there, in the capital, in the symbolic heart of the Reich. The immediate impact was twofold, material and symbolic. Materially, the disappearance of Hitler in the bunker left the command structures leaderless. Although a transition government with Dönitz appointed as successor formally existed, that government lacked real legitimacy because the charismatic leader had disappeared without effectively delegating power. Symbolically, the act sealed the narrative of the fall of the Third Reich, an individual act that certified a collective failure. For the survivors of the bunker, for the German soldiers on the fronts that still resisted, for the civilians of Berlin who were hiding in basements, the death of Hitler was the cornerstone of the end. The fact that it occurred in a bunker, isolated and without direct international witnesses, added a veil of mystery that would fuel theories and conspiracies for generations. The absence of a visible body, of a public trial, of a documented execution left a void that would be filled with speculations, denials, and myths. Hitler's suicide cannot be understood simply as another death within the global conflict. It was the epilogue act of a broader theater of destruction. The meticulous preparation, the articulation of his final wedding, the distribution of poison capsules, the shooting and the subsequent transfer of the body constitute a private rite that reflects the public decomposition of a regime. This moment sets in motion the cycle that will be addressed in the next chapter. The improvised cremation of the bodies and the immediate treatment of the remains. the first step in a chain of concealments that would transform a corpse into a political mystery. The ashes of the Fuhrer, the improvised cremation. The death of Adolf Hitler in the bunker was merely the beginning of a chain of events whose immediate goal was to make his body disappear. What followed was not a solemn burial or a funeral ritual, but an improvised operation of physical destruction amid the urban chaos of Berlin. Under constant bombings, without established protocols and with the sole purpose of preventing the dictator's corpse from falling into Soviet hands, the last loyal followers of the Fuhrer began a process that would mark the beginning of decades of mystery and manipulation. Once the suicide was completed on the afternoon of the 30th of April 1945, the closest members of Hitler's entourage set in motion the instructions he had left. His body and that of Eva Braun were to be cremated as quickly as possible. The transfer from the private bedroom of the bunker to the small garden that led to the exterior building of the Chancellery was organized with stealth and urgency. The aides Heinz Linger and Otto Günsche coordinated the operation along with armed SS escorts. The bodies were wrapped in military blankets and transported through the corridors of the bunker up the emergency stairs until reaching the surface. The Chancellery Garden, which had previously been used as a vehicle transit area and occasionally as an outdoor meeting point, had been transformed into a desolate landscape. Bomb craters, debris from adjacent buildings, remnants of destroyed furniture, and twisted metal covered the area. It was in this environment where the cremation attempt would take place. The act represented both the fulfillment of Hitler's personal will and a preventive measure. The dictator did not want his corpse to be displayed or used symbolically by the victors, as had happened with Mussolini's body only a few days before in Italy. The cremation was carried out outdoors, under conditions that were far from any conventional funeral procedure. The assistants and officers present used gasoline drums that had been stored in the bunker for use by emergency electric generators. The bodies, still wrapped in blankets, were placed in a shallow depression near the entrance of the bunker. Gasoline was poured over the corpses and the combustion was ignited. The context was devastating. Berlin was being attacked from multiple directions. The surrounding streets were ravaged by infantry fights. Military and civilian vehicles lay abandoned or destroyed, and the garden itself had been partially hit by previous bombings. The cremation process fell far short of what a professional crematorium would achieve. Several fundamental factors prevented complete combustion. Firstly, the open space without a thermal containment chamber did not allow reaching the necessary temperatures to completely reduce bones to ashes. A human body requires sustained temperatures above 800 degrees Celsius for several hours for effective incineration. Open-air combustion with gasoline as fuel reaches significantly lower and irregular temperatures. Secondly, the human body contains a high percentage of water and soft tissue which absorb heat, significantly slowing down the combustion process. The bones, especially the denser ones like the femur or the skull, require prolonged exposure to high temperatures to disintegrate. In the makeshift conditions of the Chancellery Garden, this was impossible to achieve. Additionally, environmental factors complicated the process. The nearby bombing created unpredictable air currents that dispersed the heat. The rain that fell intermittently during those days in late April partially extinguished the flames or reduced their intensity. The lack of additional fuel limited the duration of the cremation. Later testimonies mentioned that wood from bunker furniture, remnants of doors, and other flammable materials were used to sustain the fire, but the effectiveness remained limited. The result was that the cremation was partial. Subsequent Soviet chronicles described the remains found as partially charred bodies, with burned tissues, but bone structures still recognizable. The fire cast unsettling shadows over the destroyed garden. The characteristic smell of human tissue combustion mixed with kerosene and various materials spread across the area. The aides who supervised the process remained nearby, ensuring it did not go out completely, but aware that the result was far from the total disappearance that Hitler had ordered. When Soviet troops stormed into the area days later, what they found was precisely that: a shallow crater, scattered charred remains, burnt blankets, fragments of furniture turned to ashes, and, according to later forensic reports, bodies hastily buried under debris and earth. A CIA document dated the 10th of June 1945 describes that the remains of a severely burned male corpse were delivered in a wooden box of specific dimensions. This indicates that although there was cremation, complete destruction as intended was not achieved. After the initial combustion, the remains were provisionally buried in a shallow pit dug in the garden of the Chancellery or in an adjacent bomb crater. This improvised burial was due not only to the military urgency, the Soviet troops were advancing rapidly, but also to the practical impossibility of keeping the place under surveillance or carrying out a more elaborate procedure. The bodies were placed in what was left of the blankets, partially covered with earth and debris, in a desperate attempt to hide them. The urgency was dramatically accentuated on the morning of May 2nd, when Soviet units definitively penetrated the center of Berlin and began to surround the government complex. At that moment, the priority of the German officers who still remained in the area turned to flight or suicide, not to preserving mortal remains. The burial was de facto a concealment without dignity, without formal record, without markers. The last defenders of the bunker abandoned the place or took their own lives. The Chancellery garden was deserted, strewn with corpses, rubble, and the partially burned remains of the dictator. On the 2nd of May 1945, units of the Belarusian Front of the Red Army advanced towards the Reich Chancellery. According to Smersh documents, the Soviet military counterintelligence, the discovery of the bodies took place in the garden where they lay partially burned and partially buried. Later, Soviet reports mention that the remains were identified mainly through dental characteristics, since much of the soft tissues and bones had been affected by the fire. The identification was based on dental bridges, porcelain work in the upper jaw, and other specific dental characteristics of Hitler. The bone remains were mixed with melted metal from weapons and nearby military equipment, with pieces of concrete from the bunker, and with debris from the garden. This mixture of materials greatly complicated the forensic chain of custody and generated uncertainties that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. The Soviet forensic examination was conducted by a team of pathologists under strict military mandate. The reports described that the male body showed multiple signs of severe burning, charred skin over most of the body surface, skull partially affected by extreme heat, scattered bone fragments that had to be collected from the surrounding area. However, the dental bridges remained sufficiently intact to allow identification. Subsequent dental analyses expanded the identification base. The work of dental assistant Käthe Häusermann, who had collaborated with Hitler's personal dentist, allowed for the bridges found to be compared with previous records she remembered from the treatments given. Her statements under Soviet interrogation were crucial in establishing the identity of the remains. A significant limitation of the forensic analysis was that the destroyed condition of the skull and bone remains prevented the immediate performance of full toxicology tests. This initially left room for speculation about the exact cause of death, whether it was primarily the poison, primarily the gunshot, or the combination of both. The overall assessment by later historians accepts that the cremation was an improvised process that managed to partially destroy the bodies but left enough remains for a basic forensic identification. This episode of improvised cremation acquires a profound symbolic meaning. The death of Hitler was not only an individual act, but the physical disappearance under fire of one of the most destructive systems in history. At the same time, his elusive and battered body symbolized the total loss of control of the Nazi regime. There was no state funeral, there was no secret successfully preserved, only an accelerated, hidden, and fundamentally disordered destruction. The intention to completely erase his body from the face of the earth reveals that Hitler understood the symbolic power of mortal remains. He did not want to become a war trophy nor an object of popular revenge. But the material execution of that desire was profoundly imperfect. The remains stayed, were identified, and guarded. The supposed total disappearance was actually a fragmentary attempt that allowed his corpse to continue being an object of power, although inverted, after his death. The treatment of the body in this phase prepares the ground for what will come in the following chapters: the systematic search and investigation by the Soviets, the manipulation of the historical narrative, the efforts to hide or physically make the remains disappear more effectively. The improvised cremation was not the end of the story of Hitler's body, but the starting point of a complex journey by the physical matter until its transformation into a political symbol and historical mystery. The materiality of the remains, burned, partially buried, then identified, conditioned the way in which the victorious and the defeated could narrate his escape, his death, and his legacy during the following decades. The Body Hunters, the Soviet operation. The visible disappearance of Adolf Hitler's body after his suicide created an immediate urgency in the Soviet command to recover what was left of the dictator and ensure that his end was documented as definitive proof of the defeat of the Third Reich. In the days following the fall of Berlin, Soviet military counterintelligence launched a systematic operation to locate, identify, and secure the remains of Hitler and Eva Braun amidst the absolute chaos that reigned in the German capital. After the final fall of Berlin in early May of 1945, units of the 1st Belarusian Front and the 3rd Shock Army moved toward the Reich Chancellery complex. On the 2nd and 3rd of May, Smersh agents, the counterintelligence of the Red Army, whose name is derived from the Russian contraction of death to spies, entered the devastated garden of the Chancellery with the absolute priority of locating human remains that could belong to the Fuhrer. According to a subsequently declassified Soviet forensic report, the remains of the male body were found in conditions of severe deterioration. The corpse was delivered in a wooden box of specific dimensions, manifestly charred, with much of the skull and torso unrecognizable due to the action of the fire. In accordance with documents released by the FSB in recent times, the finding occurred in a bomb crater within the bunker area, approximately 3 meters from the entrance of the underground shelter. There was a male body and a female body, both partially burned, covered with debris and wrapped in remnants of military blankets. Given the extensive destruction of the remains, identification could not be based on facial recognition or standard body identification methods. The Soviet forensic team relied primarily on dentistry. Technical reports show that metal bridges were found in the upper jaw, porcelain crowns, and dental pieces that matched the records of Hitler's personal dentist. A later dental analysis examined X-rays taken in 1944 and compared them with the findings of May 1945. The conclusions were significant. The male body had a metallic restoration in the left central incisor and a lingual bridge connecting the right canine to a premolar. These elements were specific to Hitler's dental history and were documented in the regime's medical records. Dental work from the female body was identified as corresponding to the history of Eva Braun, allowing Soviet investigators to conclude that both remains indeed belonged to the couple who had committed suicide in the bunker. Once the remains were provisionally identified, they were held under strict Soviet custody. The documents show that the dental bridges and jaws were sealed in special containers that were delivered directly to Smersh in Berlin on the 8th of May 1945, the same day the unconditional surrender of Germany was signed. The symbolism of the date was not accidental. The Soviet military victory was accompanied by physical control over the remains of the main enemy. The subsequent transfer was carried out in absolute secrecy to Magdeburg within the Soviet occupation zone with full operational discretion. The remains were stored in an underground military depot initially managed by Smersh and later transferred to the custody of the KGB. According to later historical investigations, the remains were moved on several occasions to prevent their exact location from becoming public knowledge or a site of worship for Nazi sympathizers. During this initial period, the public information issued by Soviet authorities was deliberately contradictory. Despite having the remains in custody and having performed preliminary forensic identifications in June 1945, an official note was issued stating that Hitler had not been located and that there was a possibility he was still alive. This contradiction was partly due to the need to create strategic ambiguity against the Western powers and partly due to internal Soviet propaganda interests. The operation was not without internal complications and political disputes. In the first few months after the war, different voices within the Soviet apparatus issued contradictory statements about Hitler's fate. While some military commanders in Berlin expressed certainty about his death, Stalin himself, during diplomatic meetings with American and British representatives, sowed doubts about a possible escape of the dictator to Spain or Argentina. This deliberate contradiction was based on a complex political calculation. By suggesting that Hitler could have escaped to areas under Western influence, the USSR projected suspicion about possible connivance or incompetence on the part of the British and Americans. This narrative fit perfectly with the emerging climate of distrust that would lead to the Cold War. The Stalin-Hopkins-Harriman meetings in 1945 include explicit references to these insinuations, despite the Soviet leader having internal information that clearly pointed to suicide in Berlin. The forensic examination report from the 11th of May 1945, signed by Lieutenant Colonel Krajewski and other medical experts of the Belarusian front, describes in detail a severely burned male corpse, with the bones of the skull partially destroyed, the tongue trapped between the teeth, a characteristic sign of cyanide poisoning, and recognizable metal bridges in the upper jaw. Charred tissue remains adhered to bone fragments, and evidence of intense but incomplete combustion were also recorded. However, the Soviet file would not be free from subsequent controversies. In 2009, a sample of the skull fragment that the USSR had attributed to Hitler was independently analyzed by American researchers. The results indicated that the fragment belonged to a woman approximately 20 to 40 years old, which raised new doubts about the integrity of the Soviet identification process. This discrepancy has led some historians to consider that the operation suffered from initial identification failures or that information was manipulated during the process. However, the majority of the academic community accepts that the combination of dental remains, which were not questioned by subsequent analyses, and Soviet documentary evidence are sufficient to establish that Hitler died in the bunker. The confusion about the cranial fragment is probably due to the fact that multiple bodies and body fragments were found in the Chancellery garden, leading to attribution errors in the initial chain of custody. For the USSR, recovering the remains of Hitler represented a fundamental symbol of victory, the physical and verifiable end of the main enemy of the war. The operation allowed that, although with international opacity, the dictator was internally presented as dead and his body under Soviet custody. For the Western Allies, this information, when finally shared partially, offered a necessary closure to the hunt for the main Nazi criminals. The operation also served to generate a narrative of control. If the USSR possessed the remains, it had the material proof that the regime had been defeated absolutely. That possession became a symbolic asset during the Cold War, allowing Moscow to maintain the mystery as a tool of political and ideological pressure. Soviet research was marked by extreme secrecy. The files remained classified, the interrogations were not accessible to Western researchers, and the final location of the remains was kept confidential for decades. The inevitable result was a proliferation of theories about Hitler's escape and survival. The internal contradictions of the Soviet file, such as the later discovery that some fragments did not correspond to Hitler, partially weakened the formal credibility of the operation, although they did not alter the fundamental historical conclusion that he had died in the bunker. The Soviet strategy of controlling the narrative proved to be as important as the military action of physical recovery. Hitler's body, or what was left of it, was transformed into an object of power that Moscow administered according to its changing political interests. For years, the remains remained hidden in military facilities, accessible only to a very limited circle of security officials and authorized forensic scientists. The operation for the recovery of remains does not conclude with the forensic identification of May 1945. Its development prepares the ground for the next phase, the transformation of the corpse into a propaganda theme, the deliberate denial of information, international escape rumors, and the use of the body as a political symbol during the decades of the Cold War. From this moment, Hitler's physical body begins its metamorphosis into the myth, a topic that will be addressed in the next chapter, where it explores how the opaque management of the remains fueled conspiracies and alternative narratives that persist to the present day. The political corpse, the myth of the surviving Fuhrer. The fate of Hitler's body transcended the biological to become a political, propagandistic, and conspiratorial instrument of global dimensions. The deliberately constructed uncertainty around the remains fueled for decades rumors of survival, propaganda clashes between powers, and the consolidation of an absent corpse as an ideological artifact. This chapter examines how an identified and guarded body operated in the global imagination as if it were missing, available for any mythical projection. At the end of the Battle of Berlin, only two parties had direct access to the scene of the suicide and the physical remains: the bunker leadership, quickly dead, captured or dispersed, and the Soviet forces that took the Chancellery. While internally the Soviet intelligence advanced towards dental identification and controlled storage of remains, externally the USSR decided not to present a clear and definitive version. In June of 1945, Soviet spokespersons publicly claimed that Hitler's remains had not been found and that there was a possibility he had escaped. This dissonance between reality, remains under custody, and the official version, doubt and suspicion, opened up a new political space. Hitler's body, already recovered and technically identified, was politically treated as if it were missing. This gap would be systematically exploited by the USSR for years, transforming a forensic fact into a tool of international power. The Soviet motivations to maintain ambiguity were multiple and convergent. First, suggesting that Hitler might have fled to Western areas cast suspicion on the British and Americans, insinuating possible connivance, incompetence, or even tacit protection. This narrative fit perfectly with the climate of distrust that would crystallize into the Cold War. Stalin, in diplomatic meetings in 1945, hinted that Hitler could be in Spain under Francoist protection or in Argentina, despite having internal information that clearly indicated his suicide in Berlin. Secondly, the monopolistic control of the material evidence conferred upon the Soviets, a symbolic privilege. They possessed the physical certificate of the destruction of the absolute enemy. By not sharing it publicly, they maintained the ability to modulate the narrative according to their changing political interests. Finally, for internal Soviet propaganda, a potentially fugitive or cowardly escaped Hitler allowed for the prolongation of narratives of permanent revolutionary vigilance, of a latent enemy useful for justifying internal control measures and the continuity of the anti-fascist epic. In practical terms, the USSR installed a paradox. It knew more than it said, and what it said contributed to Hitler's corpse, already located, operating in the world's imagination as an absent body, available for any conspiratorial projection. On the Western side, the immediate priority after the German surrender was twofold: to capture the surviving Nazi high command and to determine with certainty the fate of Hitler, to prevent his political or symbolic instrumentalization. Faced with Soviet opacity, the British and Americans undertook their own investigations. Between 1945 and 1946, British intelligence commissioned historian Hugh Trevor Roper to reconstruct Hitler's last days through exhaustive interrogations of bunker survivors. The Trevor Roper report, which would later become the book The Last Days of Hitler, concluded emphatically that Hitler had committed suicide in the bunker and that his body had been partially incinerated in the Chancellery garden. This reconstruction, based on converging testimonies, provided the West with a coherent narrative in the face of the Soviet information void. In parallel, agencies like the FBI and later the CIA collected and evaluated reports of alleged sightings of Hitler in Europe, the Middle East, and South America. The declassified files show hundreds of reports from civilians, diplomats, or informants who claim to have seen Hitler in hotels in Colombia, estates in Argentina, monasteries in Spain, or even on ships heading to Antarctica. None of these reports withstood serious verification, but the mere existence of such voluminous files reflects the political pressure to close the case definitively. While the USSR strategically managed suspicion, the West was trying to produce certainty through testimonial reconstruction and indirect analyses. This clash of narratives generated a paradoxical effect. The more strenuous the Western attempts to prove that Hitler was dead, the more ground the conspiracy narratives suggesting that something fundamental was being hidden gained. The myth of the surviving Hitler would not have thrived without a crucial element, the documented reality of the successful escapes of numerous Nazi criminals. Adolf Eichmann traveled to Argentina under a false identity and lived there for years until being captured by the Israeli Mossad in 1960. Josef Mengele managed to escape to South America and died in Brazil in 1979. Several officers and mid-level cadres of the regime used the so-called rat lines escape networks that crossed Italy and Spain to South American ports, with support from sympathizers, sectors of the Catholic Church, and covert structures of former allies. These clandestine routes, now exhaustively documented in European and Latin American archives, granted narrative plausibility to the idea that if so many Nazi criminals had escaped, Hitler could also have done so. Rumors of submarines arriving on Patagonian coasts, secret bases in South American jungles, or hideouts in Spanish monasteries were supported by partially real facts, verified escapes, effective logistical networks, verified institutional complicities. Hitler's absent body thus became a potentially displaced body, fueling speculations that mixed real evidence with conspiratorial fantasy. Between the late 1940s and the following decades, the figure of a living Hitler was established on three distinct levels. At the intelligence level, for approximately 1 decade after the war, some offices continued verifying reports of sightings, not because they seriously believed Hitler was alive, but due to bureaucratic protocol. Any hint related to the principal criminal of the century had to be formally evaluated and dismissed. At a media and sensationalist level, popular magazines, widely circulated books, and later television programs exploited the ambiguity. The narrative of the dictator escaping to the end of the world offered drama, international intrigue, and an unfinished antagonist, especially functional during the Cold War to fuel fictions of hidden threats and global conspiracies. The political corpse thus fragmented into cultural merchandise for mass consumption. At the ideological and extremist level, for certain neo-Nazi circles or those nostalgic for the regime, the idea of a surviving Fuhrer operated as a mythology of resistance. Hitler not dead, but strategically hidden, waiting for the moment to return, symbolically denying the absolute defeat of National Socialism. Although marginal in numerical terms, this interpretation contributed to keeping alive the political use of the absent body as a symbol of an unfinished narrative. At all these levels, the common component was the instrumentalization of the void, the fact that the international public could not see a recognizable corpse, a forensically shared international report, and an official grave left a space that was systematically filled by alternative narratives. The historiography, based on British, American, and later partially opened Russian archives, converges on a fundamental point. The mystery about Hitler's death is largely a product of Soviet political decisions, not an objective lack of evidence. The USSR retained and fragmented the information on dental identification. It issued contradictory statements at different levels of command. The remains were handled as a state secret, kept in KGB archives, with extremely limited access for foreign researchers. At the same time, alternative versions were leaked, hypotheses of doubles used by Hitler, variations in the method of suicide, alleged discrepancies in the testimonies of survivors. This pattern generated what can be understood as a strategy of active ambiguity, having the material truth but discursively managing uncertainty to maintain symbolic advantages on the geopolitical post-war board. Starting from the 1960s, and more strongly since the partial opening of Soviet archives after the collapse of the USSR, a historiographical and forensic effort was consolidated aimed at definitively closing the cycle of the surviving Hitler through accumulated evidence. The interrogations of key witnesses from the bunker show significant coherence in the description of the suicide, body transport and partial cremation, despite having been conducted in different contexts of capture and by interrogators of different nationalities. Comparative dental analyses provided one of the strongest pieces of evidence for identification. Studies conducted in different decades reaffirmed the correspondence between Hitler's dental records and the jaw preserved in Soviet archives. In 2018, a scientific study published in a European journal examined the dental remains attributed to Hitler and concluded that they fully matched the morphology described in historical sources, reinforcing the academic consensus that he died in the bunker in April of 1945. Research on alleged sightings in South America, including the review of documents recently declassified by Argentine and Brazilian governments, shows that intelligence agencies followed weak leads, many based on local rumors, misidentifications, or deliberate frauds. None of them hold up against the well-established timeline of the fall of Berlin, nor against the accumulated forensic evidence. From a rigorous historical perspective, the myth of the fugitive Hitler stands solely as a cultural and political phenomenon, not as a documented hypothesis. However, its persistence over decades illustrates the power of the political corpse. The more devastating the criminal, the more attractive the story that denies his mundane end and transforms him into an immortal mythical figure. The political corpse of Hitler does not only refer to physical remains, but to the international dispute over its meaning. For the USSR, it represented a hidden trophy, an object of state secrecy, proof of victory managed as a propaganda resource. For the Western Allies, it constituted a problem to be solved documentarily to prevent symbolic or conspiratorial reappearance. For extremist or conspiracy sectors, it functioned as a screen to project fantasies of impunity, underground resistance, or global conspiracy. For critical historiography, it became a paradigmatic case of how the opaque management of mortal remains and archives can distort public perception for generations. The result was that Hitler's body remained in political circulation long after his physical death. Not exposed in a public square, nor buried in a visitable grave, but moved to secret reports, classified files, supposed hideouts in distant continents, and sensationalist media reconstructions. That circulation fueled both massive misinformation and, eventually, the historical need for a comprehensive scientific verification to close the cycle of the myth. The next chapter examines how that material closure was attempted through the definitive physical elimination of the remains in 1970, an act that sought to close off not just a body, but also its potential to become a relic or enduring symbol. The hidden remains, Magdeburg and the final elimination. After the initial identification of Adolf Hitler's remains by Soviet forensic teams in Berlin, a second stage in the physical history of his body began, that of its prolonged clandestine custody and subsequent deliberate destruction. From 1945 until 1970, the fragments attributed to the Fuhrer, mainly jawbone, dental bridges and bone fragments, were kept, repeatedly moved, and finally disposed of within the Soviet security apparatus. This process responded to an internal political logic of the USSR and the desire to control not only a body, but a symbol with the potential to become a focus of cult worship or a propaganda tool. Between May and June of 1945, the Smersh unit of the 79th Rifle Corps moved a small set of remains from the garden of the Chancellery to military facilities located in the Buch district north of Berlin. There they remained under strict military custody until 1946, when they were buried again, this time in a military area in the city of Magdeburg, within the Soviet occupation zone in East Germany. The files later opened by the FSB confirmed that the initial deposit was made in the backyard of a house belonging to the 3rd Counterintelligence Section under a concrete slab inside ordinary wooden coffins. In those containers, 5 bodies were deposited, those of Hitler, Eva Braun, Joseph Goebbels, Magda Goebbels, and 2 of their children, all mixed without clear separation. The burial was provisional, without any ceremony, and marked only with a military inventory number. The objective was not commemorative but operational, to keep the remains out of the reach of curious people, Western spies, or possible unauthorized exhumations. When Smersh was officially dissolved in 1946, the responsibility for the remains passed to the MGB and later to the KGB. In the internal reports of the Soviet security apparatus, this file was classified as Osobaya Papka, which designated material of the highest secrecy. Between 1946 and 1970, the remains remained under the direct control of the 9th Directorate of the KGB, responsible for the protection of high-ranking officials and sensitive special operations. The information about their whereabouts was limited to a dozen high-ranking officers. The package contained the mandible and upper jaw used in the original identification, fragments of calcined skull, undetermined bone remains, and some charred textile fragments. The collection was kept in a metal envelope inside a varnished wooden box. Only the Soviet dentists who had participated in the initial identification and a small group of authorized pathologists had direct access to these materials during the following 25 years. During the 1950s, when the Cold War climate reached its peak tension, the Kremlin avoided all public reference to the matter. Secrecy served to prevent Western allies from demanding international verification or the burial site from becoming a place of pilgrimage for neo-Nazi sectors that began to reorganize in West Germany. Over the years, the presence of that clandestine burial in Magdeburg began to represent an operational problem. In 1969, the military complex where the remains were located came under the direct control of the Ministry of Defense of the German Democratic Republic. Local authorities planned to construct new military and residential buildings for officers, and the KGB feared that the construction work might accidentally reveal the secret site, generating an international scandal or becoming a focus of unwanted attention. Internal documents signed by Yuri Andropov, then head of the KGB, show that in March of 1970, it was decided to definitively eliminate the remains. The order came from the Central Committee of the Communist Party and was directly supported by Leonid Brezhnev. The text of the directive indicated precisely, eliminate the remains without leaving any physical trace that allows their location or future recovery. On April 4, 1970, a detachment of 6 KGB officers traveled from Moscow to Magdeburg with sealed instructions and high-level authorization. During the early morning, under strict secrecy and military cordoning of the area, they exhumed the remains from the small military cemetery on Westendstrasse Street. The procedure was executed with the bureaucratic meticulousness characteristic of the Soviet apparatus. The operation followed specific steps: exact location of the burial point using archived plans from 1946, extraction of the wooden boxes, internal photographic record of their contents for administrative verification, identity confirmation by comparison with previous records, manual disintegration and mechanical crushing of the remaining bone fragments, incineration in an improvised bonfire on a vacant lot near the Elbe River, careful collection of resulting ashes, and final dispersion in the course of the Elbe downstream. The operation lasted approximately 6 hours. At dawn on the 5th of April, there was no visible trace left of the original burial. The final report, sent directly to Andropov, certified that the enemy of the people had been completely physically eliminated, thus closing any possibility of future material recovery. However, not all the fragments were destroyed in that operation. The KGB decided to preserve the pieces that had historically served for forensic identification: the jaw with the metallic dental bridges and a skull fragment. These parts were archived in Moscow, in the Russian State Archive inside a sealed box labeled as Exhibits number 32/Hitler. For decades, their existence was officially denied by Soviet and later Russian authorities. Only in 1993, after the partial opening of files from the collapsed Soviet regime, was it publicly confirmed that those fragments were still guarded by the FSB, the successor of the KGB. Scientific studies conducted in 2000 and again in 2018 on those pieces confirmed their age, detected the presence of chemical traces of cyanide in the calcified tissues, and verified the match with dental descriptions documented in 1945. The decision to exclusively preserve dental parts had a dual logic. It ensured the Soviet state's ability to scientifically prove Hitler's death in the face of future doubts or historical challenges, but avoided keeping a complete body or extensive bone remains susceptible to symbolic, ritual, or political use. The physical elimination of 1970 responded to three main motivations clearly identifiable in internal documents. First, to prevent the place from becoming a focus of worship or mythification. The KGB considered that the existence of a locatable geographic point where Hitler's physical remains rested could turn into a pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazi groups, especially in the GDR, where manifestations of National Socialist nostalgia were already recorded among youth sectors. Secondly, avoid political use by Western powers. In the midst of an era of détente with the United States and negotiations on nuclear arms control, Moscow feared that a possible discovery or leak of the burial would lead to propaganda interpretations contrary to Soviet interests. Finally, exert total symbolic control over the historical narrative. Physically destroying the remains was equivalent to definitively closing the material cycle of Nazism under absolute Soviet control. No tomb, no relic, no place of memory, no object of international dispute. The scattering of ashes in the Elbe thus completed the annihilation of the body that Hitler himself had tried to carry out in 1945, but which only the USSR could effectively accomplish 25 years later. For more than 20 years, the episode of the elimination remained an absolute secret. Only after the fall of the USSR were partial details published in FSB reports and in testimonies from some of the officers involved. In 1992, Vladimir Gumenyuk, one of the participants in the operation of 1970, recounted in an interview that the order was executed without emotion, with characteristic administrative precision, and that the material burned and scattered was reduced to indistinguishable dust among sand and ash from the river. The partial opening of Soviet archives in the 2000s allowed specialized historians to access photographs of the procedure and official records of the operation. Studies by the Moscow Institute of Forensic Medicine later confirmed the authenticity of the preserved dental fragments, although attempts at DNA analysis could not be successfully completed due to the advanced degradation of the biological material after decades of storage. The destruction of Magdeburg represents the definitive physical closure of Hitler's body. From a historical perspective, it was a meticulously designed state action to eliminate the materiality of evil. From a symbolic perspective, it reveals the persistent fascination of states with controlling the mortal remains of great criminals, as if within them resided some residual part of their power or historical influence. The Soviet Act of 1970 closed a chain of successive concealments: improvised cremation in 1945, secret burial in 1945-46, multiple transfers during the 50s and 60s, and finally total elimination in 1970. What survives today, the dental fragments and a piece of skull in Moscow archives, are minimal remains of a broader history of political control over the very matter of the dictator. Hitler's body was turned into an administrative file, transferred as an object of national security, destroyed as a symbolic threat, and finally reduced to archived fragment. The following chapter examines how, based on those preserved fragments and the scientific studies conducted in recent decades, the biological and symbolic cycle of the Fuhrer is finally closed. What remains is not a body, not even a skeleton, but a dental remnant that functions as a forensic witness to the end of one of the most devastating criminals in human history. The fragment and the symbol, what remain. With the scattering of the ashes in the Elbe River in April of 1970, the body of Adolf Hitler disappeared almost completely from the material world. The only thing that survived that deliberate elimination were some minimal bone fragments, mainly the upper jaw with its metal dental bridges and a small portion of the skull preserved in the archives of the Soviet state and later the Russian state. From that moment on, the physical fate of the dictator was reduced to a fragment, a microscopic vestige that replaces the entire body and, simultaneously, symbolically represents it. This change of scale, from the complete corpse to the archived bone piece, transformed the forensic object into a historical symbol, a point of convergence between science, politics, and collective memory. The dental fragments were filed in the Russian State Archive in a metal box identified as Exhibit 32. There they remained without public display or accessible scientific study for decades, under strict custody of the FSB, the successor security service of the KGB. Only an extremely limited number of officials knew their exact location within the complex system of secret archives. The secrecy was maintained even within the Soviet bureaucracy itself. For the vast majority of the world's population, Hitler had been annihilated without leaving any material trace. With the fall of the USSR in 1991 and the subsequent restructuring of the Russian state, the new federation inherited that peculiar physical legacy. In the following years, the partial opening of Soviet archives allowed historians and journalists to confirm the existence of the jawbone and the skull fragment. These pieces gradually became the only tangible link between Hitler's documented biography and his biological end, closing the gap between written history and material evidence. In the year 2000, the Institute of Forensic Medicine of Moscow authorized a team led by historian Lev Bezimensky and Russian forensic doctors to examine the preserved remains. The study consisted of detailed morphological analysis of the metal bridges, exhaustive comparison with dental X-rays of Hitler taken in 1944, microscopic observation of chemical residues adhered to the calcified tissues and approximate dating of the bones using material spectroscopy. The results of the study from 2000 confirmed that the jaw corresponded with extraordinary precision to the dental records of Hitler's personal dentist Hugo Blaschke, and that the metal bridges matched exactly with the detailed description made by his dental assistant, Käthe Heusemann, during the Soviet interrogations of 1945. In addition, significant traces of cyanide ions were detected in the calcified tissues, which corroborated the ingestion of poison before or simultaneously with the gunshot, thus confirming the historical testimonies about the dual method of suicide. The scientific report of 2000 consolidated the identity of the fragment and conclusively debunked any residual hypothesis of body substitution or falsification of evidence. For the international historiographical community, this study represented a turning point in closing the debate about the death of Hitler. However, a second fragment, a portion of cranial vault perforated by bullet projectile, was the subject of significant scientific controversy. In 2009, American researchers from the University of Connecticut analyzed that cranial piece using sex determination techniques through bone analysis. The results indicated that the fragment belonged to a woman between 20 and 40 years old, not Hitler. The news circulated through international media and fueled speculation again about the authenticity of the remains guarded by Russia. However, the subsequent Russian investigation thoroughly clarified that the female fragment was not part of the jaw set identified as belonging to Hitler, but of another set of remains found in the same place in the Chancellery garden, probably belonging to Eva Braun or another occupant of the bunker who perished under similar circumstances. This confusion illustrates the chaos of the initial Soviet recovery in May of 1945, when multiple bodies were exhumed from the Chancellery garden under conditions of extreme military urgency and without standardized forensic protocols. However, this discrepancy about the cranial fragment does not in any way invalidate the dental identification, which continues to be considered the strongest and most scientifically verifiable proof of Hitler's death in the bunker. In 2018, a Franco-Russian team led by Professor Philippe Charlier obtained exceptional permission from the FSB to re-examine the jawbone and dental bridges using modern forensic techniques. The resulting article, published in the European Journal of Internal Medicine, concluded with scientific clarity that the metals and porcelains of the bridges matched the dental materials specifically used in Germany between 1930 and 1940, that there were no signs of chewing after April of 1945, that the anatomical configurations of roots and crowns completely matched the preserved historical X-rays, and that the micro-traces of Prussian blue evidenced exposure to hydrogen cyanide. The scientific synthesis of the study of 2018 was categorical. The remains are, without any reasonable doubt, those of Adolf Hitler. This conclusion scientifically closed a historical debate of more than 70 years, providing verifiable material evidence that complements and confirms the converging historical testimonies of the bunker survivors. Unlike other war criminals whose bodies were formally buried, publicly judged, or executed in documented ceremonies, Hitler's was reduced to a relic without conventional funeral context. The dental fragment does not evoke veneration or collective mourning. It acts exclusively as a forensic witness. It is the objective material evidence of a death that many wanted to deny for ideological, political, or conspiratorial reasons. Its preservation in Moscow archives fulfills a dual historical role, preserving irrefutable scientific evidence against revisionist or denialist theories that periodically resurface, and remembering the absolute control the USSR exerted over the last physical vestige of Nazism as a political regime. Paradoxically, the will expressed by Hitler to completely erase his own body from history ended up materializing under the logic of his Soviet victors. The dictator who tried to control even his corpse ended up as an archival object of the enemy who defeated him. Scientific studies on the remains are not just technical exercises of forensic identification. They reflect how modern history needs tangible, material, and verifiable evidence to support its collective memory against denialist currents. In an era saturated with digital revisionism, viral conspiracy theories, and informational manipulation, Hitler's jaw has transformed into a factual antidote, a piece of physical evidence anchoring historical facts against political fiction. For the forensic experts, the case symbolizes the triumph of rigorous empirical evidence over conspiracy mythology. For the historians, it represents the culmination of the process of demystifying the absolute enemy through independent scientific verification. For contemporary Russian politicians, it still implies residual symbolic power. The custody of the fragment is a direct inheritance of the Soviet victory over Nazism, a material reminder of the role of the USSR in the defeat of the Third Reich. Hitler does not have an identifiable grave, nor a commemorative mausoleum, nor a visitable physical memorial place. Berlin, completely rebuilt over the destroyed foundations of the bunker, has turned the area into a simple public parking lot and anonymous urban garden, deliberately without visible commemorative signage. A small, discreet informational panel, finally installed in 2006 after decades of public debate, briefly explains to the visitor that the Fuhrer bunker was located here, but nothing more. This deliberate absence avoids any attempt at worship, but also projects a significant symbolic void. The absolute crime has no visible body, no memorial site, no collective rite. Only minimal bone fragments stored in a remote archive and administrative documents that attest to its systematic destruction. The contrast with historical figures such as Mussolini or Franco, whose bodies had public funeral trajectories, identifiable graves, and social debates about their location, highlights the exceptional nature of the Hitler case. His body was denied, progressively erased and dissolved, as if history itself wanted to physically expel it from its material space. The remaining fragment has become a symbol of multiple simultaneous interpretative layers. Scientifically, it demonstrates the capability of modern forensic research to close historical mysteries through verifiable material evidence. Morally, it reminds us that even the most powerful dictator of the 20th century ended up reduced to charred bones and administratively archived. Politically, it testifies to the prolonged manipulation of the body by states, from ideological propaganda to neutral scientific verification. Historically, it marks the definitive end of the Third Reich's cycle, not just as a political regime, but as a verifiable physical presence in the material world. The piece of jaw embodies, in its extreme physical smallness, the absolute disproportion between the devastating power that Hitler wielded for 12 years and the radical material insignificance of his biological end. A man who mobilized armies of millions, who ordered the systematic death of entire populations, who transformed a continent into a battlefield and extermination ground, was ultimately reduced to a few grams of dental bone archived in a metal box. From the claustrophobic confinement in the bunker to the final scattering of ashes in the River Elbe, Hitler's body went through all possible stages of physical annihilation: planned suicide, failed improvised cremation, systematic concealment, deliberate destruction, extreme fragmentation, and administrative archiving. Each stage responded to a historically distinct logic: military, political, ideological, scientific, but all converged on the same fundamental purpose: to erase the physical trace of the dictator without simultaneously erasing the historical memory of his crimes. Today, the fragment preserved in Moscow archives serves as a silent reminder of that complex historical process. There is no physical grave to visit, nor a complete body to venerate or repudiate, only a minimal remnant that scientifically certifies the reality of death and, with it, the total and definitive defeat of the National Socialist project as a political system. This material and symbolic closure completes the cycle of 7 decades that began in that bunker in Berlin. The most sought-after, most concealed, and most symbolically loaded body of the 20th century ended its journey turned into a forensic fragment, into scientific evidence, into a minimal reminder that even absolute power finds its ultimate limit in biological materiality and in rigorous historical verification. The fragment and the symbol thus merge into a single reality. What remained of Hitler is not an immortal myth, but a piece of bone that confirms his death, his defeat, and his final reduction to an object of historical and forensic study.